definitely an improvement over its predecessor. Hey everyone, Ryan Reed here, and today we're talking about the second part in the Fear Street trilogy, Fear Street Part 2, 1978. And I gotta say that this film is definitely a much more enjoyable film to me than the first part was. It still has its flaws, don't get me wrong, but I felt like this was a much more even film. Now, if you haven't watched my review on the first film, definitely go check that out. I will say that it was not necessarily my favorite film. I thought it was okay, but I thought it was incredibly flawed and tonally all over the place. And I feel like they actually kind of got better with this second entry. Apparently, this was actually the third film in the production order, so it was the last one that they filmed. And I will say that I think that helped. I think they finally figured out the tone of these movies by that time, and it made it a much more enjoyable watch. Part of that could have been the fact that I really enjoy slasher movies from the time period of, Halloween to the slasher boom of like the early to mid 80s. And this film is trying to kind of be more like that. It does take place at a summer camp in 1978. And this film tries its best to kind of invoke those, those movies. But it doesn't quite reach it, but we'll get to that. Hey, a quick shout out to you for stopping and watching this video. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. And if you want to see more content like this, you like what I do on this channel, maybe consider clicking that subscribe button. It helps me out and it lets you know when more stuff comes out. Thanks everyone. And now back to this impromptu review. The plot is honestly very similar to the first movie, and in fact it's actually bookended by parts of the cast from the first film at both ends, and kind of like progressing the trilogy's plot along, I guess. As far as characters and plot, it's kind of copy paste, if I'm being honest. It's a group of teenagers. This time they're at a summer camp, which again immediately already kind of elevates it a little bit to me, because it's more reminiscent of stuff I really enjoy. There's a kid who's an outsider. There's a kid who wants to kind of fit in. There's two stoner kids who are more than they seem, type of thing. It's kind of like they just kind of went copy paste. All right, great. Awesome. They're being stalked by a killer, and it kind of just plays out with your normal slasher motif. That being said, the witch aspect that was such a big part of the first film is lessened in this one, which I kind of enjoyed. Not that I dislike that plot, but I kind of like the fact that this movie was able to kind of breathe and be its own thing versus shoving all this exposition in our face about all these characters and what's going on and all that stuff. Like I said, tonally, I think they mastered this film a lot more than they did the first movie. The kills are much more even in this film this time. They feel more kind of brutal, but altogether brutal without being spiking to this weird extreme like the first movie did. It all kind of feels even in the best possible way. It feels like we're kind of balancing the performances with the script that they have and the material and the kills and the slasher film aspect of it and everything. Everything just feels way more balanced and way more successfully put together. Again, the acting is great, just like the first film. The first film, the performances were pretty solid. I just didn't feel like the material they were given was quite as good. Here, your characters start off kind of unlikable. Like I said, they're kind of just copy and paste of the first characters. However, I think that the performances kind of bring something to these characters a little bit more this time. And by the end of it, I was more on board with our main kind of protagonists. They didn't get on my nerves nearly as much. At the beginning, I was really worried about that, because the first, once we get into 1978, that is, the first 15, 20 minutes of this movie, I was like, all right, this feels like it's just going to be kind of the same thing as last time, but it doesn't. I actually think this gets a lot better, and by the end of it, I was definitely more invested in what was going on plot-wise. And the movie also has some twists and turns that I kind of liked. They're not, anything groundbreaking or anything like that, but I did enjoy some of the tropes that they turned on their head, and I actually liked that. I kind of liked plot elements and where they went. They didn't feel like they were trying to turn things on their head just to be like, look at us, aren't we different? Which is what the first film kind of felt like. This kind of felt like, oh, okay, we're going on this kind of roller coaster ride. Interesting. And I can really appreciate that. And by the end of it, I wasn't upset that I watched it. I definitely think this is an improvement. Again, it's not a perfect movie, and I'll get into that here in a second, but I think overall, compared to the first film, This is a step up. I think if this had been the first film in the series, I would have been more like, oh, okay, all right, that's what they're doing, great. And I think by this point, probably in their shooting production, they understood the types of movies they were making, and so it just feels more coherently put together. Now, there are some flaws with this movie that kind of hold it back from being great. It kind of just make it good instead of being, oh, that was a really great, modern slasher movie. Some of those problems are, it is way too long. This movie is an hour and 50 minutes. And it's not like watching it, I was like, oh man, every bit of this information is important. No, they could have cut out like 20 minutes of this movie and we would have still got the point. Like, there's a lot of setup at the beginning, and it takes roughly 45 minutes before we get our first kill in this movie. Like, at least that's something the first film did better, which is you set up with a kill so you kind of know, oh, okay, people aren't safe in this movie. This film doesn't do that. It takes 45 minutes until anybody is killed. And a lot of that stuff is just kind of repeating what we already saw in the first film, either by showcasing the same kind of character traits or by repeating information exposition that we kind of already know from the first movie. And I don't think anybody going into this movie, especially with the way that Netflix is releasing it, is going to be... It's a week apart. Like, I don't think we need that sort of exposition again. I mean, there's a scene where our main kind of protagonist, or one of our main protagonists, again, is kind of like this outcast character, and we see scene over and over and over and over again of her kind of being an outcast. We see scenes like that repeated, and we don't need that. I think you could have shown one scene and we would have gotten it. I think the opening sequence with her, where she's kind of being chased by these bullies, tells you everything we need to know. Great, she's an outcast, people don't like her, but instead we kind of repeat that same thing a couple times. And you could have just gone, alright, let's look at this edit, it's running a little long, take that out. Slasher movies really work better when they're like 90 minutes. And apparently the next film is going to be even longer, so maybe they'll switch up the atmosphere and the way that the film works. It kind of, based on the preview they show at the end of this movie, it feels like it's gonna be more like The Witch, or something like that. They're kind of trying to go for that style, so maybe, the slower pace will work. Here, though, you don't need it. 80 to 90 minutes is about your perfect runtime for a slasher film, and when you've already got, 10 minutes to 15 minutes of bookend stuff from the previous movie on this movie, plus a lot of exposition we don't need in this film, really, just some strict editing, you could have gotten this down and made it just a lean, mean film. Instead, it drags. It is way too long. Again, I already talked about some of the kind of problems with repeating information we've already seen. I get they're kind of trying to set that up, like, oh, this type of stuff repeats, so we get a lot of the same characters, or there's literally a scene where it's Sunnyvale, I think is what the city is called, versus Shadyside again, and it's like, instead of it being a football game, it's like a capture the flag type of deal, and so it's kind of the exact same hype scene of like, oh, we're gonna kick, Sunnyvale's butts, and it's like, we literally just saw this scene in the other movie. And again, I think maybe they're trying to kind of reinforce this battle, because honestly, there's a lot of foreshadowing in this movie that is super obvious. In fact, my fiance were watching and I was like, first 5 minutes something happens that's kind of supposed to be subtly in the background. I was like, oh, this is where this is going. This is going to be this is going to be this is going to be this in the next film. She's like, oh yeah. And then by like maybe the halfway point, something else happened. And she was like, oh yeah, so it's going to be this, and this next movie. So we watch a lot of movies together, admittedly, so, maybe your average viewer wouldn't pick up on that. But for us, it was kind of like, yeah, we know where these movies are going. Okay, great. So maybe we'll be wrong. Maybe the next movie will surprise us, but it feels like they're already setting stuff up and it's kind of obvious where they're going. Again, this film is not subtle with trying to tell you when it takes place. Just like the first film had needle drop after needle drop after needle drop of 90s songs, here you kind of get the same thing. It's not quite as extreme. It doesn't happen quite as much, but I will say, again, the movie's called 1978. I don't need all these 70s songs. As much as I like the soundtrack, I don't need them dropped every few minutes to remind me that, yeah, we're in the 70s, don't forget, it's the late 70s, hey, it's the 70s. And also on top of that, there are literally score moments in this movie, like, from Friday the 13th. Like, no joke, like, exact same beats and score moments. And I'm sure Netflix or whoever made this film licensed those on purpose, like they were trying to be, like, reminiscent of Friday the 13th. They are identical. And so Again, movie, I get what you're going for. It's a 70s slasher film. You don't have to literally drop in the exact same soundtrack moments from Friday the 13th to remind me that we're at a summer camp slasher movie. I get it. So that's kind of not super subtle in the way that they do that. And I think maybe just a little bit of, pulling back again. Pulling back. Just movie. It's okay. You can be a little bit more subtle with these things. I get it. I get that it's the 70s. And so because of that, reminding me of another film series that I really, really enjoy is not going to endear your film to me more. It's actually going to stand out to me more. Also, again, I know that they're kind of going for this kind of teenage drama thing, and I think it plays out better in this one than it did the last one. But my God, there are so many moments in this movie where people just stop and have emotional moments. Like, you don't need that every few minutes. Like, seriously, they'll be being attacked by a killer, and then there will be like a 5-minute scene of people being like, well, my home life growing up, I was an outcast, and I just don't feel like I belong, and I'm trying to fit in, and I just can't. And once or twice in the film, great, I understand, and that's important. We do need some character development. Even basic slasher films, you kind of understood who the characters were. But I don't need to see the characters break down every 5 minutes to get who they are. And I think the film feels like it gives them more depth, but it actually doesn't. It just slows your movie down. Like, great example, Friday the 13th Part 2 has a character named Mark. And Mark is not the main character, but there's enough, 1 or 2 little scenes that we kind of learn who Mark is, and they don't repeat it. They don't need to reinforce it. We get who this character is. We get what's going on in his life. And that's all you need. And spoiler alert, I guess, for Friday the 13th, but Part 2. But when Mark dies, it makes his death more impactful because now we've had these 1 or 2 moments where we kind of understand who he is. Plus, we weren't expecting that. This movie, every few minutes, somebody's like having some sort of emotional beat. To the point where there is a death at the very tail end of this movie that feels like Sam Jackson's death in Deep Blue Sea. Like, I don't think it was intentional, because afterwards it's not played for laughs. It's played very seriously. But it's this big build-up where this character has a speech about their background and I'm gonna stand up for this and blah, 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 blah. And then they die. Like, it's just like, okay, I literally chuckled because I was like, movie, were you intending for that to be kind of humorous? And I think had they played it off, not like as a joke, like, it doesn't need like afterwards or anything like that, but just having that little moment of being like, characters were like reacting and then continuing the movie on, you could have rolled with it. Instead, they give this like really emotional, like, oh my gosh, they're dead moment. And it's like, film, I don't think you quite get the tone that you set up there. But again, maybe that was just me. Maybe people were watching it and were like really affected by that. It didn't really work. Also, and this is just a little thing that bugged me. I'm sure most people it didn't bug, but the first film, this killer is in that movie. Obviously, there's a bunch of killers in the first film, but he's there and he looks like the killer from The Town That Dreaded Sundown, or Jason in Friday the 13th Part 2, where he's got like a burlap sack over his head. And it's a cool looking character. We've seen characters like that, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It's well done. And so that entire first film, he's wearing that sack on his head. However, for this film, the character is not wearing it for 90% of the movie. And there is a cool scene where we see how he gets the mask, and it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. There's a cool twist on like how killers get their masks and stuff. I like that a lot. However, it happens way too late, and instead of feeling like this is the moment where he gets his mask, he's already pretty much gone on a killing spree. And so seeing that happen, it's a cool moment, but it feels like it should have happened earlier in the film rather than later, because it would be something you would do if you were setting up for a sequel. Oh, this is his identity. This is how he gets this. But he's not the main antagonist in the first movie. So because he's only partly there, it feels like they worked backwards, where they were like, oh, we've got this masked killer, but we want to surprise people with who the killer is in the second film, going backward in time, and so he has to wear a bag on his head. And so when they got to this film, they were like, oh, well, we got to figure out a way to get the bag on his head. It's a cool scene, yes, and this is, again, me just kind of looking at the film being like, but, like, instead of feeling like a cool moment completely, it feels like a plot device, so that way they couldn't spoil who the killer was. Don't get me wrong, I think the scene is great, but it's not a big deal because he's not your main antagonist. I think if the first film had only been about him being the killer, and then we saw how he got his mask, it's like, oh, cool, it's kind of like an origin thing. But because he's only in the first film for, you know, a handful of scenes, it just doesn't play the same way. It feels more like a plot device rather than a cool moment, but it doesn't really have the payoff I think that the filmmakers thought it would. But I think overall, this is a much more solid film. Again, I think this feels like the film that the filmmaker wanted to make, and again, this is all speculation because obviously they directed and co-wrote the entire thing, but this feels like the film they wanted to set out to make, and the first film was kind of like a means to an end. Like, we have to make this movie. And so because of that, the first film felt all over the place. This is still kind of doesn't quite mesh together perfectly. I think there's a little bit too much teenage drama and angst and stuff going on in it. Also, it feels a bit too polished. That was actually something that I was watching the movie and I was going, I know they're trying to make this feel like a 70s movie, but why does it not quite work? And my fiance goes, well, it's because it's too polished. And I went, you're right. She goes, yeah, I've watched enough of these movies with you to know that that's the problem. This film is way too polished. It doesn't kind of have that grit that a lot of those movies did. It just doesn't quite gel in that way. But again, it feels like a modern movie because it is, and that's okay. You know, to some people that's not going to bug them, but for somebody like me, and I'm a huge fan of 70s, 80s horror movies, when you're trying to emulate that, I really want it to feel like that. And if it doesn't, it kind of feels, you know, it just doesn't quite work. Overall, much more enjoyable, a little too long, actually quite a bit too long, but overall, a way better film, and I am looking forward to now what happens in the third movie. So stay tuned for that review. But in the meantime, if you want to see more videos like this, check out the other impromptu reviews I have on the channel. You can check out the first video I did on Fear Street 1994. Also, if you want a more analytical approach to horror movies, you can check out my show Fright Films. There's all kinds of art videos on the channel, all kinds of cool stuff, so check that out. Like this video if you can, subscribe to see more stuff, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.